Strange encounter while hunting in rural Texas. True story. This happened when I was growing up, around 2004 or 2005 when I was about 13 years old. It took place in a rural area, a good ways outside the town of Uvalde, Texas. The town itself was really small back then and not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that really isn't on the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres, I think, down outside of that area and was complaining about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land. Being open season on hogs in the south, my dad thought he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting for them. Not only did that help him with networking for his job but also gave us some quality father/son time. I remember the drive down there from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hard-top Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfy, I hated it. All had to do was either stare out the window or try and beat Super Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy Pocket, something I was never able to accomplish in my youth lol. The drive, obviously, took most of the day so we got there in the early evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that he hadn't had anyone lease it that year yet and the cabin in the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't really care. At this point in my life I had been in scouts for a couple years and spent a lot of my free time in the woods or fishing with friends. Needless to say, I was pretty comfortable roughing it. So after unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin on the land, we settled in. The cabin was pretty rough, dust and dirt everywhere, flies. I remember that it looked like some raccoons had gotten into the cabin and crapped on the floor. After cleaning up a bit and getting the sleeping bags out, then setting up the cots, we decided to sleep. Something about that night was weird. I never was able to get comfortable enough to fall asleep for any restful amount. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I had that feeling of being watched. I was finally able to drift off for what I guessed was an hour maybe. When we woke up it was early, about 7 a.m. We decided to scout around the land for tracks and signs of hogs and find a good place to set up a blind. It was the summer and horribly hot in the afternoons, so morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for an hour or so we came to area of trees, lightly dense, and luckily found some signs of hogs. Typical torn up ground where they had been rooting, so we followed them into the trees. I was looking for more signs when my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing about 50 yards away. Some of their body was blocked by trees. This was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We also had confirmation from the owner before we got to the lease that nobody was there, not to mention the gate was locked up when we first arrived. The person was wearing some bright-colored red jacket. We slowly walked toward them. My dad called out something like, "Hey, we're hunters. This is private land." The person didn't move at all, dead still. We were about 30 yards away and could see that he was turned away from us with his hands in his pockets. Weird thing was that the person was in a ski jacket and what looked to be ski pants. Now this is Texas in the summer, it was about 98 outside by then. My dad called out again, no reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnapped the clip to his pistol holster. That's all we had at the time since we were only scouting the area. The rifles were back at the cabin. We approached the person's right side and then my dad told me to stay put about 20 yards away. I stayed and crouched down, watched him circle around to the front of the man, all the while talking to him asking if he was okay. He finally passed around to the front of the man and my dad stood straight up with a confused look on his face. I called out and said, "What's wrong?" And he called back saying, "It's a mannequin." I walked over to it while my dad stood there staring, and as I got closer one thing stood out the most: the clothes it was wearing were brand new. No dust, sap, bird droppings, or signs of being outside for more than day at most. At that moment I looked at my dad and could see him get worried. Almost immediately after I felt that feeling again, like we were being watched, and I knew my dad felt it too. I wanted to start crying. I remember feeling suddenly so scared. My dad whispered, "We're leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back while I was trying to hold back panicked tears. We got back as fast as we could. I was terrified, so it felt like an eternity, but in reality was only about 45 minutes max. After returning, we packed up and beat feet. We drove back home that day, and didn't talk much on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was confused. He said that he would go check it out next week when he was in the area. He also said that he had never had an issue with people because his property was high fenced. My dad normally isn't a paranoid person, but me being young and the lease possibly having someone there we didn't know about, he decided to be cautious and just get out of there. After we got back home we talked, and my dad wasn't able to sleep the night before as well. He had the same feeling but didn't want to wake me up because he thought I was sleeping too. Turns out that next week he got a call from his buddy and he checked the whole property and never found any trace of anyone, no mannequin or anything. That story still makes my hair stand on end. No idea what that was, but the paranoid man in me thinks it was some kind of trap or something. Not the creepiest thing that happened to me in the woods, but def top 3. So whoever was out there, I'm glad we never met. I used to work on the North Slope of Alaska. Here's one of my stories. I used to work on the North Slope of Alaska in the oil industry. The work we were doing required us to travel far out into the Alaska Petroleum Reserve, which is basically just untamed tundra wilderness for hundreds of miles. The oil companies would build these long ice roads in the winter that would lead to exploration drilling pads. Our job was to go out after they finished the initial drilling and test rock formations for their oil-producing qualities. It was mid-January, the sun hadn't quite come up yet. And when I say the sun hadn't come up, I mean in almost a month and a half. Polar nights are intense. The particular well site we were traveling to was about 60 miles west of Alpine, Alaska. Deep in the wilderness. Our job took a week, but we finished and were headed back to camp to finish our hitch and go home. At the beginning and end of the ice roads are guard shacks that you have to check in and out of for safety. No cell reception and radios work only up to a distance. If you don't check in or out in a set time, they come looking for you to ensure you're not a popsicle. It was about 4 in the morning, not that it mattered in the land of endless night, and we were halfway across the ice road. Travel was slow as the speed limit on the roads is only 25 miles per hour. When something appeared on the road in our headlights. It was a man. In jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie jacket. Walking down an ice road in wilderness tundra at 4 a.m. and it was minus 20 degrees outside. It's not unusual for the local Inuit people to be out this far hunting. Maybe his snowmobile broke down and he's trying to get back to the guard shack. Seemed plausible. He didn't acknowledge us as our trucks rolled up next to him. He just kept shuffling forward. He didn't seem cold. His clothing, while totally not appropriate for this extreme weather, appeared warm and dry. We also noticed he wasn't Inuit, but Caucasian. I rolled down my window and asked if he needed any help and if he was okay. He still didn't acknowledge us, just kept shuffling forward. His face was completely blank, devoid of any thought or emotions. The other guys in my truck suggested that maybe he was in an accident and in shock. I continued rolling my truck alongside him as he trudged down the road, still trying to get his attention. Even in this extreme cold, I could occasionally get whiffs of a peculiar smell coming off him. He smelled acidic. If that makes sense. There was just a lot about this guy that made the hair on my neck stand up. The guy behind me in the truck's crew cab had had enough of all this. He rolled down his window and reached out to grab the guy. He later said he was just going to try and shake him out of his stupor. Before my buddy's hand could reach him though, this walking popsicle spun around and latched onto my buddy's outstretched arm. He glared at my buddy and then at me with this look of pure rage, not removing his hand from his arm. If emotions had a physical temperature, this guy could have melted the entire tundra that night. My buddy groaned in pain as he tried to get his arm free from Mr. Popsicle. At that moment this guy starts screaming in our faces. There was so much hate and rage and anger in that scream. It was absolutely terrifying. I slammed on the gas and spun out on the ice for a second before the wheels caught and launched us forward. Popsicle Dude still had a hold of my buddy's arm and was trying to pull him out of the truck. He was running alongside the truck while the other guys in the cab held onto my buddy to keep him inside. After several moments, it could only have been a few seconds at most, my buddy tore free from this guy and we hauled ass to the guard's shack another 30 miles down the road. We checked in with the guards and reported what we had just seen. The guard was looking at us like we were pulling a prank, but policy said they had to check it out regardless. My buddy's arm was sore and when he pulled back his sleeve there were noticeable bruises in the shape of a hand around his arm. We filed a report with the guard and were told to head back to our camp. None of us really wanted to talk about what happened and it was a quiet drive the rest of the way. We flew home the next day. The next time we saw the guard at this shack we asked him if they ever saw Mr. Popsicle on his patrols. He told us they searched up and down that ice road for a solid 12-hour shift and saw nothing, not even tracks in the snow leading off the road. He told us it was a good prank and that he'd get us back for making him waste a shift driving around. But it wasn't a prank. Who would make up a story like that? And who would willingly bruise their arm for a dumb prank? We never got a satisfying answer to what happened that evening. I still wonder about that dude, if he even was a dude. The Alaskan tundra is a weird place and that was just one of my many weird stories from my time up there. I'll work to write down more of my experiences and share them to the appropriate subs. Unsettling encounter in the Sierras. This story is, unfortunately, true. I've changed names and ages slightly for privacy. I grew up in the Sierra Nevadas. It's a really beautiful part of the world with sprawling pines, rugged mountains, and crystalline lakes. I wasn't big on camping, but I spent a good chunk of my childhood weekends hiking with family and friends and spent many summer days tubing on the lake. The summer that I was 16, about 10 years ago, now, my cousin, Celia, had come back from her first year of college, and her boyfriend, Jay, was visiting to meet her family and friends. Jay, like most tourists, wanted to go on a hike with lake views. Celia and I decided to take him on one of our favorites, a moderate hike through the woods on a gentle incline that peaks at hollow in the trees overlooking Lake Tahoe below. Jay had some hiking experience, albeit in less rugged terrain, and we thought this hike would be a fun challenge with the spectacular views he wanted. It is an in-and-out trail that takes about 2 to 3 hours to the top and 2 to 3 hours back down. There are some smaller trails that branch off and offer steeper inclines or winding paths down towards the lake. The three of us set off on the hike on the first Saturday of his visit. The trail isn't the easiest to find, but it's really popular with locals because of the view and general lack of tourists. It was mislabeled on the most popular trails website at the time, so it was hard to find if you didn't like where to look. We passed only a couple of other hikers, mostly granola-type couples with camelback water backpacks hiking with their dogs. We made it to the top in good time and enjoyed our lunches overlooking the lake. Jay was appropriately impressed by the views and spent a lot of time taking pictures. In between selfies and bites of sandwiches, we mostly just relaxed and got to know each other. After about an hour of relaxing, we heard a scream in the distance. Specifically, a mountain lion scream. If you've never heard a mountain lion scream, it's really unnerving. It sounds a bit like a very loud, terrified woman letting out a blood-curdling shriek of terror. YouTube it, it's truly a horrible sound. This was not good, because when a mountain lion screams, it's either part of a mating ritual or two male lions are fighting. Either way, hearing one scream meant there were multiple mountain lions, and close. The bears in the Sierras are softies, but the mountain lions will attack you. They'll attack your pets. They've even been known to attack bikers. There's safety in numbers, but even 3 is risky if you're talking about a hungry lion, Jag was really freaked out. There weren't big predators roaming around where he's from, and the thought of an animal large and willing enough to eat him was off-putting. Celia and I were wary but not alarmed. Between the natural disasters that frequently occurred in the region, earthquakes, wildfires, mega blizzards, and the sometimes deadly wild animals that got close to town, we were fairly unshakable. We had seen plenty of bears and snakes on hikes, and sometimes encountering critters is the price you pay to enjoy the natural beauty. It also wasn't the first time we had heard mountain lions, and we had both seen them before, albeit mostly from the safety of a cabin or a house. There was also an incident where, as kids, we laid out some expensive steak in my backyard in the hopes of luring a mountain lion to take pictures of it. It did not work and my mother was unhappy about the steaks. Anyway, Celia and I told Jay that it was fine, but that we need to pack it up and get back down the mountain. We packed up the leftovers of our lunches and took off at a brisk pace back down the mountain. About 40 minutes into the hike back, Jay realized that he forgot his phone at the lookout in his rush to leave. Of course. After a brief back and forth between Jay and Celia, I don't need it back that badly. Jay, it has all of our pictures from the spring break trip, not to mention you're a broke college student. Yes, you need it back. We decided to go back and get it. Well, we decided that Celia and Jay would hike back up to retrieve his phone and I would stay there, on the trail, alone, to warn any other potential hikers that there are lions in the area. I was mostly worried about those hikers with their off-leash dogs and wanted to prevent a wandering lab from getting mauled. This was obviously not ideal for any of us, but seemed like the best choice at the time. I found a nice rock to sit on in the shade just off the trail and was going through the pictures we took on my phone and playing Temple Run. There was no cell service or internet, but I knew they'd be back soon. Celia and Jay had been gone for around 50 minutes when I heard the scream again. And it was hard to tell, but I thought it was closer than before. I started to get pretty nervous. Being in groups is far preferable when dealing with mountain lions, and I felt like perfect bait sitting there alone on the woods. About 20 minutes after that, I heard the scream again, and there was now zero doubt that it was closer. It sounded like it was coming from up the trail, towards where Celia and Jay would be coming down, very soon. I sincerely hoped. Logically, I knew that lions don't scream when hunting, they are quiet. If a lion was hunting me, I wouldn't know it. The screaming meant it was doing something else, something not feeding related. That knowledge did not make me less nervous. I became hyper-alert, whipping my head around every time I heard a noise or thought I saw a flash of movement. I turned my flashlight on even though it was the middle of the day. I got off my rock to stand in the middle of the trail to have visibility up, down, and in the trees on TN side of the trail. A couple minutes after that, I heard it again, extremely close by. By this point, I had full goosebumps and a pit in my stomach, a complete sense of dread. I looked around and tried to find the best place for me to stand, back covered, in case of the worst. I decided to wedge myself up against a tree next to the rock I had been sitting on. I had good visibility up and down the trail, still, and into the trees across the trail. I continued scanning around, focusing on up trail where I thought the screams were coming from. Suddenly, I saw something. Standing still, 20 feet up the trail, a couple feet off of it, was a man. He was completely naked. He was filthy. He was skinny. And he was just standing there, looking at me. I didn't even hear him come up. It sounds cliché, but it really was like he appeared out of nowhere, especially since I had been focusing on looking for the lion in that direction. If you don't know where you're going, it's easy to get lost in the woods around there. The weather can change quickly, and people panic and get more lost in their attempts to find their cars. And it doesn't take long, being alone, lacking food and water, in the wilderness, to make people a little disorientated. A little crazy. The infamous Donner Party incident happened maybe an hour away from where I was standing. My first thought was that this man was probably a lost hiker, and judging by how dirty he was, he'd been lost a long time. He needed help. I had heard about people with hypothermia stripping all of their clothes off, and thought maybe that was what happened. Now, this took place during the summer and there's no way that someone would get hypothermia in July, but that didn't occur to me until later. I started walking towards him, asking if he's okay. I suddenly got this feeling of wrongness. I don't know how else to describe it, but my feeling is dread tripled, the hair stood up on my neck. I stopped in my tracks, maybe 15 feet away now, and had the overwhelming urge to run away. It seemed wrong, it felt wrong, he looked wrong in a way I can't quite articulate. Instead of wanting to help him, I was absolutely terrified of him. I asked again if he's okay. He looked at me, then opened his mouth wide and screamed. Not a normal scream. He screamed just like the mountain lion, a high-pitched, keening shriek that made my blood run cold. It occurred to me that we were probably hearing him the whole time. It was the single most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. I started screaming too. I was preparing to run away, down the trail, I suppose, but also really did not want to turn my back on him. Suddenly, he closed his mouth, turned around, and ran into the woods very quickly. He disappeared into the trees, but the feeling of wrongness was still with me. I felt like I was going to throw up. I considered bolting down the trail to get away, but decided to wait for Celia and Jay, who luckily arrived within 10 or 15 minutes. I told them what happened, and we decided to call it into the Rangers when we got service. Celia and I had seen some odd things in our lives, her more than me, but she turned white as a sheet when I told them what happened. I guess they didn't hear anything at all on the way down. I've always been deeply unsettled since the incident. Did I see a mentally ill lost hiker, who really needed my help? Or did I see something else? Celia insists it was a skinwalker or something similar, something malevolent and inhuman, mimicking the call of a mountain lion and stalking us down the mountain. Please like and subscribe, it helps the channel a lot, and yes, thank you for listening to the story. I enjoyed reading it. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. So okay, anyway, until next time. See you later.